Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about how to pick the right project. And this comes from a question from Bridges Chroma 1832, who asks, can you talk about how project approval decisions are made in game companies? Do they follow the will of a singular lead designer, or do they get talked about a lot before any actual effort is put into it? Does something akin to military democracy exist at game companies? Now, I wasn't 100% sure what Bridges meant by that, so I asked for clarification. Do you mean deciding what project to make? Which led to a yes and a further, for smaller companies and studios, when they have more choice with their own ideas, how do they pick the right one within the company? What project do they make? So, let me talk about that because I've done that several times, where I've been at the beginning of a project and having to decide what project to make. And I think every time it's boiled down to the same thing. And so the high level answer to this, the TLDW, is going to be pick something that leads into your team's strengths and the size and time you have available to you. So, I mean, if you know your team is going to be a certain size and made up of a certain number of individuals, and you only have so much time, and by time I ultimately mean budget, to make it that's pretty much everything you need to know what kind of game you're going to make. So let's dive down into that. So, by size slash time, I basically mean this is the point where you select the scope of your game. And by scope, I don't necessarily mean how long it will take to play the game. I mean, it basically boils down to how many features you want in the game. The more features you have, the richer the game is, but also it takes a lot longer to make, not only because the individual features take a long time to work on, but there will often be a lot of interactions between those features. Once you put in lots of skills and lots of perks and lots of traits and lots of backgrounds, those are going to interact. And then it will bring up questions about, hey, there's a bunch of bonuses that are very similar. Do they stack? Hey, these bonuses all work on aspects of this skill. How do they interact? Hey, these bonuses seem to be contradictory, or these effects seem to be contradictory. What happens when they're both in play? These are things you're going to have to decide. So sometimes you want to do fewer features, which is great. A game that focuses on a very specific set and narrow set of features is really good. But if you do that, you better make sure those features count. You really want them to be front and center for whatever kind of game you're making. So if you decide that your game is going to have parkour in it, make parkour the main part of this game. That there's places to climb to that are important, that there are creatures that can chase you that can't climb. There are some scary ones that can. Make climbing integral to the game. Similarly, if you decide, I want physics in the game, I want, things to break apart, and I want those things that breaks apart into to be interactable, and I want NPCs to be knocked about. If you do that, that could be a really fun game, but you have to lean into it. You have to realize this is going to be your main feature. Once you put it in, lean into it. Have weapons that do things with physics. Have lots of explosions, have lots of things that can, maybe slice an arm off or a leg off, or can do things to enemies that make use of this wonderful physics system that you obviously want to make. And that's kind of what I mean by scope, which is once you know how many features you can do, pick features that count. By strengths, I mean take a look at what your team is good at. If you have a lot of narrative designers, make a story-based game. If you have a lot of artists, and mostly artists, make a really cool visual game. Either a adventure game with not a lot of interactions, but a lot of places to explore, or puzzle games that look gorgeous but have very simple underlying mechanics. For that, like you move some things around, and when they're in the right configuration, things happen. or maybe standing at a particular location makes things look a certain way, and that gives the player the solution to get past the next door or the next barrier. Those are things you can do if you look at your team very objectively and say, this is what we're good at, this is what we're not good at, and then do those things. I've told this story before, but when I was making Fallout, and for the first few months it was just me, one thing I did was I made different engines. I made a 3D engine, polygon engine, software rendering, because 3D cards weren't out in the mid-90s. See, this is probably the early 90s. I made a voxel engine, which voxels are kind of 3D pixels. Minecraft really made a big thing with voxels, although I'm not sure. Let's just say I made a very different kind of engine than Minecraft, but it was made up of 3D voxels, and it was really good for doing things like water and elevation. It was less good for doing things like creatures and buildings. And then I made a third engine, which was a sprite engine, a relatively generic, here's a bunch of sprites moving around on a isometric surface. I did add elevations to it. When we decided to make Fallout and I started getting more people involved in it, we looked at those engines and looked at who I would probably be able to get, and we went with the sprite engine. Now, I know there were a lot of people that went, oh man, 3D's the wave of the future, you've got to go 3D. Well, it wasn't there yet. The future wasn't there yet. And picking a 3D engine would have been a huge mistake for a game like Fallout. We were making a 3D game with Starfleet Academy, but that was just a few ships and a big empty skybox. Similarly with the voxel engine, I wasn't imagining that the game Fallout would eventually become would be a game about elevations and water. I needed buildings. I needed structures. I needed NPCs. So the voxel engine was just not the way to go. So we went with the sprite engine because that was the best thing for the strengths that our team had. Now you also are probably asking, well, who decides this? Who's the final decision on this? And there's basically two answers there, and it depends on how you're making the game. If someone's funding you, they probably have a big decision-making capability in this. If someone's giving you the money, they can often tell you what to make. And I've been in the position where I've made several games where the main decision about what the game was fundamentally like was not mine. Somebody else made it. I leaned into it. I tried to do all the things that, I thought I was good at bringing choice and consequence, bringing interesting characters and story, and gray morality. But some of the games I made, the basic choices about whether it was going to be isometric, what the setting was, or the elevator pitch was, things like that were not made by me. It was made by the people who are going to pay for it. And this will happen frequently. However, if you're lucky enough to have a funder who doesn't have an idea in mind, or you're doing this indie, what you probably want to do is look at who on the team has the strongest vision and good communication skills. Those are important to have together. If you have somebody who has a strong vision but can't share it with the rest of the team, they might as well not have a vision, because unless they're planning to make the whole game themselves, they've got to be able to express that to the other team members and get them on board. Similarly, you may have a guy who's a good talker, but if he doesn't have any of his own ideas, then you're fine that you're constantly redirecting your effort into different things as stuff catches that person's eye. Like, oh, this new game came out and it does this, it has this feature, we should do that. Or, hey, I know we were making a post-apocalyptic game, but what if we made it fantasy instead, and let's just repurpose all the monsters as fantasy monsters. That would be a horrible thing to hear a year or two into making a game. So I would say that depending on the situation you're in, either the funder or the strong vision communicator is the person who should ultimately pick what the game is mainly about and go with it. Now, you may be wondering, well, what about all the team members? What say do they have? Tons. Team members often sway the choices being made. A big chunk of it is they know what they're good at. So people can come to you and say, I can't do art of this style, or I'm really good at doing creatures like this. If somebody comes to you and says, my animations tend to be kind of rigid, maybe you should make a game with robots and not a game with snakes and um, lots of smooth animations needed. If someone comes to you and says, hey, um, I've been playing a lot of games in the area we're playing in, of the kind of game we're trying to make. Like, let's say maybe you're making a fantasy RPG, and there's someone on the team who goes, I play every fantasy RPG that comes out. And these are some really popular features right now that get a lot of attention. And here's what people are saying they wished these games did. That's a great team member to give advice on what kind of game or game features you should make. And then this comes up a lot, especially if you're being funded. People want to know, what is your hook? What is the thing your game is going to be known for? This game does this well, or that's the game that does this. I don't think hooks are 100% necessary, but in general, games I've made that have had hooks, those hooks have come from someone on the team who felt really strongly about a particular feature and wanted to lean into it. And because it coincided with the strength of the people on the team, and they were very good at communicating this idea, that became the game's hook. If you make a game with a hook, it becomes a lot easier for you to market your game and talk about what kind of game you're making, answer journalism questions, show a journalist something that he can very quickly get a soundbite out of and write an article about. You don't have to have a hook. Really, really good games that do a lot of things great don't need a hook, but it never hurts to have one. So, excuse me. I hope Bridges Chroma, I pretty much answered your question. I think what I just described is a good process for you to figure out what kind of game to make, who should make that decision, and who should contribute to that decision. So I hope Bridges Chroma 1832, this answers your question.